nothing, all right? We have things for you at low prices, things you can Africanize your home, you can Africanize your body with our scents and our oils, and you can Africanize your wardrobe. So today and every Wednesday, we're gonna have African artifacts and products for your buying pleasure. Now, getting back to our speaker, I think about Imhotep. I think about the Dogon star. I think about the fact that we are the originators of civilization. Okay, civilization began with us. We taught the world how to embalm the dead. We taught them how to fly airplanes. We knew about astral projection. So when Brother Maddox says we need to take care of our people, we need to take care of the people who are doing the work to correct history. Brother Browder's bio is here for your reading pleasure. I'm not going to read it to you, but I think it's important for you to know this is a brother who's self-employed. All right? This is something we need to let our children know. You can take care of business. You can correct our history and at the same time take care of your family. You do not have to depend on the Europeans to make you do the right thing in terms of correcting our history. This is a brother who's self-employed. He's an author. He's a publisher, and he knows truth. Let's stand up, warm our hands, and welcome our brother, our guest speaker for tonight's forum, Dr. Anthony T. Browder.
Hotep Africans, how are you? All right, you all sure know how to make a brother feel at home. Thank you very much for that warm reception. And as usual, it's always my pleasure to be here, to be in New York, to be in Harlem, to walk where my ancestors have walked and have struggled for so long, to fight the forces of oppression, to walk in the same land where Dr. Clark has walked, where Dr. Ben is still walking, where John Jackson has walked, where so many of where Shashi McIntyre has walked. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here before you this evening and to continue the process of the re-education of African people, because it is a process. It is something that's not going to happen overnight. Brother was just sharing with me before I came down. I asked him how he was doing. He says he has his ups and downs, and I said, well, so does the sun. Sun goes down, but it comes back up, you know. And that's the nature of the universe in which we live. Everything is cyclical. Everything follows a pattern of growth and development, and then of decline. But then it follows a cycle of growth and development again. Everything in the universe is cyclical. And when you understand that, it kind of helps you put our life and our experience into perspective, because you realize that we're down now, but if you understand Sankofa, we weren't always down. And if you know how to practice Sankofa, then you can participate in our rising again. Everything is cyclical. Everything follows specific patterns. And once you begin to become aware of the true nature of the universe, you don't get lost. You don't get blindsided by some of the craziness that goes on right in your own backyard. You can keep your eye on the light at the end of the tunnel and not have your vision obscured by the darkness that is the tunnel itself. So these are lessons that I've been very fortunate to have learned standing at the feet of some of the masters, some of the master teachers. Must say that what I've done in my career as a writer, as a speaker, as a researcher, I've done primarily as a result of my being inspired by great writers and thinkers. John Jackson, John Henry Clark, my elders, my ancestors, and Dr. Ben, my elder, they were responsible for introducing me some 25 years ago to the greatness of Africa. They helped me realize, after I had completed my study at Howard University, they helped me realize that I had been miseducated, and that there's another education that I needed to be actively involved in, and that I had to be responsible for getting that education myself. And so I always have to honor those who helped put me on the path, and in honoring them, I understand my responsibility to help to show others the path, because that is why we're here, to learn and to teach others and to continue to grow. As I was sitting in the back of the room listening to some of the comments that Brother Maddox was sharing with you, it brought several thoughts to my mind that I'd just like to share with you as well. The example that he gave about the Uncle Tom gene was a brilliant example. But you know, I was talking with this gentleman who works out in Silicon Valley, who's involved in a lot of the genetic research that's going on. And I was asking him about the statements that were made about 3 or 4 weeks ago concerning the mapping of the human genome. I mean, that's the latest project that's going on as Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein is still at work trying to make new monsters for the new millennium. And they were talking about the fact that they celebrated the fact that they just about completed the mapping of the human genome. And in an article, as a matter of fact, I was in Egypt. I just returned from Egypt 2 weeks ago. And I read an article in the Cairo newspaper that talked about the Human Genome Project, but they mentioned something about the Human Genome Project that I had not read in any publications here in the United States. They made mention of the fact that the organizations, the companies that are working, that are doing the research on the Human Genome Project are working with the genetic material of a selected group of people. And they didn't say in the article who those selected people were. But I asked this brother who's working out in Silicon Valley about that, and I said, well, you know, who would they, you know, do you have any idea whose genetic material they're working on for the Human Genome Project? He said, well, you know, if you were a geneticist mapping the genes in the human body, you would want the oldest human genes on Earth. The genes of the oldest human beings on Earth. So in other words, they're studying us in order to learn about them and to also find new ways to continue to control us. So the war is on, sisters and brothers. It's just going to begin to escalate to a new level. And we have to begin to prepare ourselves to fight this war on a new level. And that's basically what I want to talk about this evening. My topic for this evening is the rebirth of Nile Valley civilization. And I see it as an extension to my earlier work, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, which is one of my best-selling books. It's a book that I'm very proud to say has been used in classrooms throughout the United States, Japan, England, Africa, France. I get letters from people all over the world who are using the book in various classrooms. And so I'm very pleased to be instrumental in reintroducing people to African history and culture. I've also been blessed to have traveled to Egypt some 25 times over the last 20 years. As I said, I just returned from Egypt 2 weeks ago, completing my annual study tour to Egypt. I've been doing the study tours for the last 12 years. And the more I travel to Egypt, the more that I study ancient Kemet, the more I began to develop a deeper understanding of not only the Nile Valley contributions to civilization, but also something else that I see in the eyes of my sisters and brothers, and something else that I see in the horizon, and that is rebirth of Nile Valley civilization. Because once you begin to put history in context with human development, then one of the things that becomes so fundamental to your understanding is the fact that life is cyclical. As I was talking about earlier, life is cyclical. And in understanding the cyclical nature of life, you realize that death is temporary. All death does is pave the way for the continuation of another life. So when you look at Kemet, when you look at the civilization of ancient Egypt, don't listen to the commentary about how the Egyptians had a preoccupation with death. Don't listen to the commentary about, they spent years building their tombs and building their pyramids in order to honor the ego of a pharaoh. Don't listen to that. Understand that these people had a preoccupation with life. They knew better than we do right now that life is eternal, that the body is temporary, and the spirit is eternal, and that the spirit, when it leaves this physical body, returns to another physical body. And that's the lesson that you see that is played out in the history, in the myths, and in the culture of not only ancient Kemet, but the rest of the African world. That's information that has been lost or that has been distorted by other people in their attempt to gain some understanding or some insight into the wisdom of ancient Africa. But part of what I'm going to share with you this evening, and I want you all to stay with me on this because it may be a little bit of a stretch, but I want you all to stay with me on this. Part of what I'm going to be talking about deals with the process of reincarnation. All right? Reincarnation is nothing more than return to the flesh, or the spirit returning into the flesh. There was an article that appeared in Philadelphia last week, and there was an article that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer that I want to bring to your attention. And it referenced a Rabbi Yosef, who has the largest ultra-Orthodox political party in Israel. And he created an international furor last week when he said, and this is a quote, a direct quote, that the 6 million Jews who died in the Nazi Holocaust perished because they were reincarnations of sinners. Okay? He said that these people were reincarnations of the souls of sinners, people who transgressed and did all sorts of things that should not have been done. And they were reincarnated in order to atone. Now, folk got hot because they said that he was letting Hitler off the hook. But the issue that wasn't really focused on in the article is a brief statement by another chief rabbi in Israel who said that Judaism has a concept of reincarnation and of the righteous dying to atone for sins in the previous life. Now let me repeat that again. Judaism has a concept of reincarnation that most people don't know about. It is an element that is incorporated into Christianity that Christians never talk about. And it's also an element that is incorporated into Islam that most folk don't know about. These concepts and these ideas originated in Kemet. And what I want to share with you during the course of my presentation and with some of the slides that I'm going to share with you as well is how this concept has played itself out thousands of years and is literally encoded in the symbols, the monuments, and the buildings that can be found all over the world. Automatics made reference to the African-centered tours of Washington, D.C. that I've been doing for a number of years and that UAM has participated in on several occasions. As a matter of fact, I was talking with a couple of sisters in the back of the room, and is it all right if I say it? All right, they're making plans to organize another tour to Washington on the 12th of November. So we're going to be doing another African-centered tour for the group that comes down. And it's something not to be missed from the standpoint of what I've done with this tour is to study the extent to which ancient Kemetic architecture, symbolism, philosophy, and spiritual traditions have been incorporated into the very fabric, into the very heart and soul of the United States of America. And not only can these symbols be found in the United States, but if you know what to look for, if you understand the history, if you understand the symbolism and know how to interpret the symbolism, you can find the symbolism anywhere in the world. That, to me, is one example of the resurrection or the rebirth of African spirit, African symbols, African concepts, and African ideas. These symbols don't exist just in a vacuum, in a void. These symbols, this architecture and this knowledge was created, I'm convinced, it was created in order to remind us here in the present of who we were and what we've done, and to begin to inspire us so that we can become actively involved in the process of rebuilding for eternity. Because we are, whether we truly understand it, we are our ancestors. They live in us. Something that geneticists don't talk about is something called genetic memory. And it is the essence of this whole process of cloning. Every gene in your body has the memory of every gene that ever produced it throughout its entire bloodline. So you in this room have within you the genomes, the genetic memory of every person who has been a part of your bloodline. The key is, the challenge is to learn how to access that memory and then to use that knowledge in order to build for eternity. See, that's the information that was lost through the Middle Passage. That's the information that was lost or destroyed with the introduction of religious systems, which I see as nothing more than virtual spirituality. All right? And so we have to be actively involved in the process of understanding who we were before we can begin to know who we are and do what we've always had the capacity to do. And so, for the sake of time, I want to begin to get into this presentation and just basically set it up with this premise. Just as we've been actively involved in the process of rescuing and reconstructing our memories of Africa, and then learning how to apply this information into our daily lives on a consistent basis so that we can see permanent change or achieve permanent success in what we do, there are those forces that exist within this society and within this world who don't want that to happen. There are people who profit from your ignorance. They profit from your hatred of Africa. They profit from your blind adoration of European and Arabic gods as a result of us turning our backs on the prototypes for those gods and religious systems. They profit off of our ignorance. And so the only way that they can maintain their power is by keeping us in darkness. So there is going to be, don't fool yourself for 1 minute, there's going to be an ongoing struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And you need to understand that so that you can begin to make a conscious choice as to which team you're going to be on. To choose to be ignorant and not be involved in the process is to make a choice. It's to make a choice to side with those who want to keep you in darkness. And this story of the struggle against the forces of light and the forces of darkness was written about in ancient Kemet and was exemplified in the story of the battle between Set and Heru. And if you understand the essence of the story of Asar, Set, and Heru, it is a story about reincarnation. It is a story about the continuation of the life cycle. I want to reference, before I get into the slides, which are a major part of my presentation, I want to reference a book that the Dr. A.C. Hilliard wrote about 2 years ago. I think it's his latest publication. The book is entitled Saba, The Rebirth of the African Mind. And Saba, SBA, is an ancient Kemetic concept that represents teaching, wisdom, and study. Saba is the process by which we can participate in another Kemetic concept called the Reme Mesu. Reme Mesu means the repetition of the birth, or the reawakening of the mind with a knowledge of your previous existences. Reawakening of the mind to the knowledge of that genetic memory, which is a part of your consciousness, a part of your being. So this whole story about the rebirth of Nile Valley civilization is about the rebirth of the African mind. Because when you reconstitute your mind, when you regain your African mind, then you begin to see the world differently. You begin to relate to yourself and others differently. And this Negro consciousness, which has been planted into the back of our minds, can no longer coexist with an African consciousness, with an enlightened African consciousness. The Negro mentality exists only in darkness. It lives off of fear and ignorance. It lives off of fear and ignorance. And it embraces problems as its lot. It's oblivious to the fact that we live in a universe of plenty, where a properly attuned mind, a properly focused mind knows how to extract out of the universe things and powers that will advance its development. We live in a universe of bounty. Everything you need, everything you want already exists. It's simply a matter of you understanding that and then doing the things necessary to bring it into manifestation. I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation, but I want to make you aware of the fact that there are certain keys to decoding the mysteries of ancient Kemet. The first is to know your history. To know your history, the history of Kemet before it became a multicultural civilization, before it became Europeanized. The second point is to understand mythology, to understand the power of the myth of ancient Kemet and how that myth continues to live and how it fuels society today. The third point is to correctly interpret symbolism, and to understand the silent power that exists within objects that you see every day, but are disconnected from that power. And the fourth is to understand Kemet's relationship to the Western world, to understand that relationship so that you can begin to become an active participant in the spiritual rebirth. That is, there was your reason for being born. One of the concepts that's talked about quite frequently in African culture and civilization is that you as a spirit made a conscious choice to be born in this lifetime. You as a spirit chose your parents because you chose to come back to this life at this particular point in time to experience certain things that would allow you to advance your development. So when you understand that you chose to be here because of certain lessons that you must learn, when you are actively involved in the process of learning those lessons, of studying, developing wisdom, and then applying that wisdom in your life, then you begin to fulfill your spiritual purpose in life. And the person who understands their spiritual purpose in life experiences no pain, no discomfort, no poverty, because they know that they live in a universe of bounty, of plenty, and they know how to manifest everything that they need in order to improve the quality of their life. They're not greedy. They know what they need. And they use what they need not just for themselves, but for the benefit of those who will come behind them. So if we can have the lights, I'd like to begin the presentation, the slide presentation. And of course, for those of you who don't know who these brothers are in this picture, they are John Henry Clark, John Jackson in the center, and Dr. Yosef Ben Yakina. Oh, okay, you can't see because I'm here? All right, well, let me move the podium to the side if that doesn't pose a problem. Is that better? Yeah. All right. Okay, next slide, please. I must add that it was John Jackson's book, The Introduction to African Civilization, that I read 20 years ago, that really made me develop a strong appreciation for African culture and civilization. And it was the first trip that I made to Egypt 20 years ago with Dr. Ben that literally opened my eyes and made me realize that our perception of reality had been distorted by Europeans, and that there was another truth that exists within the world that we have a responsibility to expose ourselves to learn from, and to teach others. And so this image here, this building here, is important because this is a photograph of the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. It is the oldest building ever created by human beings, designed by Imhotep. This building was created over 5,000 years ago and is still standing in Africa today. A 197-foot high skyscraper, a 19-story building that was constructed by Africans at a time when Europeans were still living in caves and wearing animal skins. Africans developed the first buildings on Earth. And it's something that we should never forget. Next slide is a photograph of a statue of the person who was responsible for designing that building. His name is Imhotep. And Imhotep is a prime example of Saber, of a teacher of someone who studied and someone who applied the wisdom that came from their study. Imhotep is a prototype or a model for an inspired African mind, because he obviously tapped into a level of consciousness that had not shown its face in Kemet for hundreds of years and maybe even thousands of years. Imhotep is regarded in history as the world's first Renaissance man. Not only was he an architect, he was a prime minister to the King Zoser, he was a philosopher, he was a poet, the person responsible for giving us the statement, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you shall die." He is recorded in history as the world's first physician. There are medical texts associated with Imhotep that treat various ailments of the human body, that reference an understanding of the heart and the flow of blood through the heart, the circulatory system, the medical texts that identify aspects of the brain, the various portions of the brain, a phenomenal personality who is recorded in history as the world's first multi-genius. Imhotep, in building or designing the pyramid, set a standard that would transform the consciousness of the world. Next slide. Less than 300 years after Imhotep built the step pyramid, the first man-made structure of stone. We're not talking about mud bricks here. We're talking about structures made out of stone. Less than 300 years after he built the step pyramid of Saqqara, this pyramid was built, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, which is structured from the time of its construction around 2500 BC up until 1887. This building was the tallest man-made structure on Earth. It's a building that stands 450 feet high, as tall as a 45-story building. It is a structure that covers an area of 13 acres, 2.5 city blocks wide by 2.5 city blocks wide by 2.5 city blocks wide by 2.5 city blocks wide. It is a structure that is comprised of enough stone to make 30 Empire State Buildings. It was a structure designed by an African architect, constructed by African engineers, a structure which is still regarded today as one of the greatest achievements that ever sprang from the minds of human beings. It was inspired by the work of Imhotep. Next slide. It's at the Giza Plateau where you can find a complex of pyramids. 10 pyramids exist at the Giza Plateau. Giza is probably the most significant archaeological site on the planet. There have been more books written about these structures than any other subject on planet Earth. And what's so phenomenally interesting is the fact that mankind today, in all of its greatness, cannot replicate the building of a great pyramid. They don't have the technology. There are 5 stones in the interior of the Great Pyramid that weigh 70 tons each. Each stone weighs the equivalent of the engine, a railroad engine, the Amtrak. I came down on the Amtrak. So each of these 5 stones in the inner recesses of the Great Pyramid weigh as much as an Amtrak locomotive. Mankind today does not have the technology to move a 70-ton piece of stone. And there are 5 in the Great Pyramid. There are other blocks of stone in the temple of Harlem, of the so-called Sphinx, which weigh almost 100 tons. So what we're dealing with here, sisters and brothers, is evidence of human beings, African men and women, who had a level of knowledge which humanity has not seen in over 3,000 years. Next slide, please. At last count, there were 108 pyramids in Egypt. They just found a new pyramid earlier this year, right? Nowhere on Earth can you find these many structures. Only in Africa can you find these structures. What's interesting is that there's been a host of new research on Egypt and on the Giza Plateau. And some of the latest research that's been presented by 2 Europeans, Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock, have shown that the alignment of the 3 pyramids at Giza replicate on Earth the alignment of the three main stars in the belt of the constellation of Orion. This is not an accident, but this was an effort on the part of the designers of this structure to recreate the heavens on earth. As a matter of fact, another important component of this celestial relationship is right near the constellation of Orion, you have the Milky Way, or a structure that the Egyptians referred to as the river in the sky. And this relationship between the three stars in the belt of Orion here and the Milky Way is identical to the relationship between the three main pyramids at Giza and the river on earth called the Nile. This is not an accident. This is part of a very calculated and very well executed design to replicate the heavens here on earth. Next slide. There is in Nubia, which is south of Egypt, there is in Nubia more pyramids than exist in Egypt. At last count, there were over 200 pyramids in Nubia. And those who understand the significance of the Nile Valley, the culture, which was ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt, came out of the south, came out of Nubia. So it is in Nubia where you can find the beginnings of pyramid building. It's in Nubia where you can find the beginning of the writing of the so-called hieroglyphics or Medu Neter. It is in Nubia where you can find the beginning of the Trinity, the sacred trinity of Asar, Aset, and Heru. These are indigenous African creations. And the further south you go into Africa, the more you can find that represents the flowering or the staging of what later became the crowning glory of Africa, which is ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt. Next slide. It is in Nubia, at Abu Simbel, where you can find one of the grandest monuments ever created by human beings, ever conceived by human beings. This is a monument built in honor of Ramesses II. He built it in the southernmost part of Egypt, right near the border of Nubia. This is a structure which was literally carved out of a mountain with 4 60-foot-high statues of Ramesses II. In between the two groups of statues, two groups of seated statues, there's a doorway. And 180 feet in the interior of this mountain, hollowed out of the mountain itself, is the next slide, which shows you a scene of Ramesses II seated among the Neteru of ancient Kemet. This sacred altar was designed in such a way that only 2 days out of the year, on the date of Ramesses' birth and on the date of his coronation, the sun shines through the interior of the mountain 140 feet into the mountain onto the face of Ramesses II on 2 days out of the year. Now, can you imagine, first of all, can you imagine Africans sitting down at a table planning this monument, all right, and presenting this plan to Ramesses, telling him how they're going to immortalize this man and not only place him among the Neteru, but orient this structure in such a way that the sun is going to shine on your face on your birthday and the day of your coronation. We're talking about not only a profound understanding of architecture and engineering, but astronomy as well, which means that they had to map the heavens and they had to be able to project the angle of the trajectory of the sun 140 feet into the interior of this mountain. And then they left their handiwork for the world to see. All right? I want you to understand what existed in ancient times, because its essence continues to exist today. Its essence lives in you right now, whether you are conscious of its essence or not. Next slide. Now, what I also want you to be conscious of is just as the essence of your ancestors exists within you, the essence of the forces of creation, there's also within this world the essence of the forces of destruction, the essence of the forces of evil. And they have been working overtime to keep you separated from your true self. All right? This is a photograph of the father of Ramesses II. His name is Seti I. And one of the things that Seti did at the temple of Abydos, the temple that is, just for the record, it is the first holy site in the history of humanity. Abydos was the site of the first Mecca in the history of humankind. And in this temple, which Ramesses built, there is a scene where he explains to his son his history and his culture. There's a listing on the wall of all of the kings who preceded him. And he goes on to explain to him the legacy which he has inherited. So he comes to the throne with a total understanding of where he came from and what his responsibilities were as a king. Ramesses went on to become one of the oldest rulers and one of the most prolific builders in ancient Kemet. That is the reason why he's referred to as Ramesses the Great, because no one built as much as he did. Now, if Ramesses was great in the history of ancient Kemet, there are those who are enemies of ancient Kemet who want to do whatever they can to defame Ramesses, to destroy his legacy. And we need to be conscious of these efforts so that we know how to identify them when they appear and how to address those who are the perpetrators of this historical fraud. Next slide gives you one example. How many of you all saw The Prince of Egypt? The first feature film produced by Steven Spielberg's new company was an animated cartoon called The Prince of Egypt, which perpetuated the lie of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt. It perpetuated the lie of the Jews building the pyramid, and it perpetuated the lie of Ramesses being the pharaoh or the king who was associated with the Exodus. Even in Jewish texts, Jewish scholars are now coming out and saying that the Exodus never occurred. They're saying that it was a metaphorical event and that it never occurred. But yet this lie, this myth is being perpetuated continually in the media. We have to begin to understand our history so that we can intelligently challenge those who distort the historical record. So we have to be conscious of the historical record so we can speak intelligently about these issues. Next slide. Another example. How many of you all saw the film The Mummy? All right? In this film, which was made last year, a film that was a remake of Boris Karloff's 1933 classic horror film. In this movie, they not only defame Imhotep, because in the story, the mummy is Imhotep. Okay? The mummy is Imhotep. But in this version of the story, they added an element that was not in the original version. In this story, in this movie, they show Imhotep as the head priest who is in love with the wife of the pharaoh. And the wife of the pharaoh, or the pharaoh that Imhotep was serving, was Seti I. Now, Seti I was the father of Ramesses. And Ramesses lived almost 1,200 years after Imhotep. So I want you to understand how they are taking liberties with your history and your culture in order to defame your ancestors. And in this film, they make Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius, out to be the bad guy. This film made so much money that they're currently working on Mummy 2. Right? So one of the things that I want to challenge you all to do is to read Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Read Black Man of the Nile and his family. So when the second abomination called Mummy 2 comes out, you all can talk to your friends and tell them why they shouldn't see that movie. Or if they go to see the movie, you all can sit down and critique the movie and tell it why, and tell them why they wasted their money. We need to begin to understand how to wage this battle on another level. All right, next slide. The essence that the enemies of Kemet, that the enemies of Africa want to undo lies in the story of this man, lies in the story of the family of this man. This is Asar, who is recorded in the history of humanity as a model for manhood, the model for divine rulership, the model for judgment, the model for law, the model for civilization. Imhotep is recorded in the ancient myths of Kemet. And when I reference a myth, I'm not just talking about something that is a fallacy. Most myths are rooted in truth, but they are presented as myths because myths become larger than life. Myths serve as a way of reaching out to people throughout the eons, throughout the ages, and transferring lessons from one generation to the other. So in the story of ancient Kemet, Asar was the first king of ancient Kemet. Asar married as his wife, next slide. Asar married an African who we know as Aset as his wife. And Aset is the model for womanhood. Aset is the model of the divine vessel through which the reincarnated spirit or the ancestors are reborn. Aset is a model of a woman who understood the sacred nature of her body. All right? And this story of Osiris-Isis-Heru was a story that was taught to the children. It was a primer for life. It was a primer that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. And as these children matured, then they would begin to be introduced to other facets of this story so that they can begin to understand how it related to their lives on a larger level, on a larger scale. Next slide, please. So if you were a child living in ancient Africa, you would have been taught. You wouldn't have been taught about Dick or Jane. You wouldn't have been taught about Barney. You would have been taught about Asar and Aset. And you would have been told of how Asar was responsible for introducing agriculture to humanity, introducing writing, science, law. You would have been taught how Asar was looked upon with envy by his brother. And the next slide show you how Asar's brother, Set, next slide, plotted to murder his brother. And not only did he kill his brother, but he cut his brother's body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout the land. If you were introduced to this story as a child, you would have been taught of how Aset, in the next slide, Aset went out in searching for the missing pieces of her husband's body, and how she found 13 of the 14 pieces of her husband's body. And she attempted as best she could to reconstitute her husband, to reassemble his body. She washed his wounds, and then she wrapped his entire body in the bandage in order to prepare him for burial. It took her 70 days to find the missing pieces of her husband's body. 70 days to prepare her husband's body for burial. And this 70-day period became the standard length of time for the process of mummification for every person who died in ancient Kemet. So they took their myths literally because they understood the power that was inherent in the myths. It's important to realize that before Aset buried her husband, She grieved his loss, 1, because she loved him dearly, 2, because she was still a virgin. They had never consummated their marriage vows, and 3, because she didn't have the honor of bearing him a child, an heir to the throne. So as the spirit of Asar saw his wife and saw her in her grief, the spirit of Asar came and impregnated his wife. And then 9 months later, the virgin Aset gave birth to her son Heru, who was born to avenge the murder of his father. Next slide. Heru then becomes the model of the 15 Christs who lived in history. Heru was born on December the 25th. Heru was born of a virgin. Heru was born to complete his father's work and to restore his father's kingdom on earth. Heru was, on a deeper level, Heru was the reincarnation of his father, who was reborn in order to continue his work. The story of Heru and his uncle Set set the standard for the historical battle between the forces of good and evil. Next slide shows you a photograph from the temple of Edfu. So in the temple of Edfu, which is dedicated to Heru, you see carved on the interior of the retaining wall 14 panels which depict the battle between Set and Heru. And in this battle, Heru takes the form of a hawk, and he spears Set, who is depicted in the shape of a hippopotamus. And he spears him in each part of his body that is related to a part of Asar's body that was dismembered. Next slide shows you a detail of Set. Shows him being speared in the nose, shows his feet being bound in chains. Then after Set was defeated, then Heru became the legitimate heir to the throne of ancient Kemet. And after his victory, Heru, next slide, took the form of a falcon, flew into heaven, and met with his father, told his father of his victory over Set. And upon that meeting, his father, Asar, was resurrected from the dead, was restored, his spirit was restored, and he became the Lord of the afterworld, or the Lord of the underworld, also referred to as the Lord of judgment. And then Heru came back down to earth to continue ruling in his father's name. So father and son ruled in tandem. The son, Heru, ruled over the physical world. His father, Asar, ruled over the spiritual world, the transphysical or the metaphysical world. They ruled in tandem. Next slide. This is an image of the resurrected Asar, who is recorded in history as the world's first resurrected savior, as the world's first resurrected personality. I might add that this story was written in Nubia over 6,000 years before the birth of Jesus the Christ. All right, so let's put it in context so we understand from whence these myths have evolved. And let's understand these myths. Next slide shows you another symbol that was built in Kemet that represented the resurrection of Asar. Right? This is a symbol called a Tekken. And it was erected in front of the temples in Kemet to represent the resurrection